on the beach at Iwo Jima in February of 1945, amid some of the most intense combat of the entire Pacific War. A Marine radio operator crouched in a foxhole and spoke rapidly into a field telephone, in a language that no one listening on the other end of the line, including trained Japanese cryptanalysts monitoring American radio traffic throughout the battle, could understand at all. The language was Navajo, spoken fluently by a small group of Marines recruited specifically for this purpose, transmitting real-time combat orders, artillery coordinates, and troop positions across the battlefield in a code that Japan's intelligence services never managed to break for the entire duration of the war, despite years of trying. This is the story of the Navajo Code Talkers, the Marines who turned an indigenous American language into one of the most effective and unbreakable battlefield codes of the Second World War, and the Japanese codebreakers who, unlike almost every other cryptographic challenge they faced in the Pacific, simply could not find a way in. It is worth noting that the Navajo were not the only Native American group whose language was used for military communications purposes during the Second World War, with smaller numbers of Comanche, Hopi, Meskwaki, and several other tribal groups contributing similar language-based communications support in other theaters or units during the conflict. The Navajo program, however, grew to by far the largest scale of any of these efforts, both in the total number of men trained and deployed and in the sheer volume and criticality of the message traffic they handled across the extended, multi-year Pacific campaign, which is part of why the Navajo Code Talkers in particular became the most extensively documented and publicly recognized example of this broader wartime practice once the classification restrictions were eventually lifted. The idea behind the Navajo Code Talker program originated with a civilian engineer named Philo Parker, who had grown up on a Navajo reservation as the son of missionaries, and understood, from first-hand experience, just how genuinely difficult the Navajo language was for outsiders to learn. Navajo belonged to the Athabascan language family, structurally unrelated to English, German, Japanese, or any of the European or Asian languages that Axis cryptanalysts had trained to study, and it had almost no written literature or standardized instructional material available outside the Navajo community itself in the years before the war. Critically, at the outbreak of the Second World War, fewer than 30 non-Navajo individuals in the entire world were believed to understand the language with any fluency, a number that included linguists and missionaries, but almost certainly no one within Japanese or German intelligence services. Parker proposed to Marine Corps leadership in early 1942 that this obscurity could be turned into a genuine tactical advantage, not merely by having Navajo speakers transmit messages directly in their native language, but by developing a specialized, formalized code built on top of the language itself, adding an additional layer of security beyond simple linguistic obscurity. The Marine Corps, after an initial demonstration convinced skeptical officers of the concept's practical value, authorized the recruitment of an initial group of Navajo men, and this original group worked together to develop a codebook that assigned Navajo words to represent military terms, letters of the alphabet, and specific tactical vocabulary that had no direct equivalent in the traditional Navajo language, since concepts like tanks, dive bombers, and machine guns simply had no pre-existing Navajo terminology. The initial group recruited to develop this system, 29 Navajo men enlisted in early 1942, worked together in a dedicated development period before ever being sent to combat units, essentially building the entire codebook themselves, from scratch, based on their own knowledge of the language and their understanding of what military terminology would need to be represented. This original group is now generally recognized as having laid the foundation for a system that would eventually grow to include several hundred Navajo Code Talkers, serving across the Pacific theater by the war's end, though the specific codebook itself remained a closely controlled document, memorized rather than physically carried by every code talker who used it in subsequent years of the war. The code the original Navajo recruits developed was considerably more sophisticated than simply speaking military orders in Navajo, and this additional layer of construction is what ultimately made it so resistant to any cryptanalytic attack Japan might attempt. For the alphabet, code talkers memorized a system in which each English letter was represented by a Navajo word for an object whose English name began with that letter, itself then translated into Navajo, so that spelling out a word required a listener to first translate a string of Navajo terms back into their corresponding English first letters, then assemble those letters into the intended word, an additional decoding step layered on top of translating the language itself. Military terminology that had no direct Navajo equivalent was handled through an assigned system of substitute words, chosen from the natural world and Navajo daily life, so that a dive bomber became the Navajo word for a specific type of hawk, a battleship became the Navajo word for whale, and a general officer was referred to using a term denoting a particular tribal leadership role, terms that carried no obvious military meaning to anyone unfamiliar with the assigned codebook, even if that listener somehow happened to understand spoken Navajo itself. This dual-layer construction meant that the code talkers were not simply relying on linguistic obscurity, the mere fact that almost no one outside the Navajo community spoke the language, but had built an entirely separate cryptographic system on top of that obscurity, one that required knowledge of the specific codebook vocabulary in addition to fluency in the underlying language itself. It was this combination that made the system so different from, and so much more secure than, earlier attempts by American forces to use other Native American languages, including Choctaw speakers in the First World War, for similar purposes, none of which had involved this same additional layer of constructed code vocabulary. Training for new code talkers required memorizing the entire codebook, several hundred terms in total, to a level of fluency that allowed for rapid, real-time transmission and translation under combat conditions, with no written codebook permitted anywhere near the battlefield itself, precisely because a captured written reference would have instantly compromised the entire system for every code talker using it. Every single code talker had to carry the complete code in memory alone, a demanding requirement that necessitated extensive training before any of them were deployed to combat units in the Pacific. Recruitment for the broader Code Talker program that followed the original founding group presented its own distinct challenges, since Marine Corps recruiters needed candidates who were not only fluent in Navajo but also literate in English, a combination that, given the limited educational infrastructure available on reservation lands in this period, meant the pool of eligible candidates was considerably smaller than the overall Navajo population might have suggested. Many of the young men who ultimately volunteered had attended government-run boarding schools that had, in an earlier era of federal policy, actively discouraged or outright punished students for speaking Navajo at all, a policy whose deep irony became apparent only once the same language these schools had tried to suppress was recognized as one of the most valuable tools available to the American war effort in the Pacific. Navajo Code Talkers were deployed to combat units across nearly every major Marine Corps engagement in the Pacific Theater from Guadalcanal onward, typically operating in pairs, one code talker transmitting a message while another received and translated on the other end of the communication, a system that allowed for both speed and an internal check against transmission errors given how much depended on getting operational details correct in the middle of active combat. The practical value of the system became clear almost immediately once it was fielded, offering Marine commanders a genuine speed advantage over conventional mechanical or manual encryption methods, since a fluent code talker could encode, transmit, and have a message decoded on the receiving end in a fraction of the time required by the cumbersome cipher machines and codebooks used elsewhere in American military communications, all while providing a level of security that, as far as post-war investigation has established, Japan's intelligence services never managed to penetrate at any point during the war. The code talkers themselves operated under conditions of extraordinary combat exposure, embedded directly with frontline Marine units, rather than working from any kind of protected rear area communications post, which meant they experienced the same intensity of combat, and in several documented instances the same casualty rates, as the infantry units they were attached to. At Iwo Jima specifically, a battle regarded by many Marine Corps historians as one of the most communications-dependent engagements of the entire war, given the compressed, brutal nature of the fighting across a small volcanic island honeycombed with Japanese fortifications. Marine Corps signal officers later stated that the volume and speed of message traffic handled by Navajo Code Talkers during the battle's opening days was so significant that, in the assessment of at least one senior signal officer involved in the campaign, the Marines could not have taken the island as quickly, or with the coordination they achieved without the Code Talker communications network functioning at full capacity throughout the battle. Beyond the specific tactical value of speed and security, the Code Talker system also solved a more mundane but persistent problem that plagued conventional American battlefield communications throughout the Pacific War. Mechanical and electronic encryption devices were often bulky, required careful maintenance in harsh tropical and volcanic island conditions, and could fail or be damaged during the exact intense combat moments, when reliable communication mattered most. A code talker required nothing beyond a standard field radio and his own trained memory, an approach far more resilient to the physical conditions of Pacific Island combat than mechanical cipher equipment, which frequently suffered from humidity, sand, salt exposure, and the general physical abuse of frontline conditions. Japanese signals intelligence units, who had by this stage of the war demonstrated real skill at attacking a range of American and Allied communications systems, including partial and sometimes significant success against portions of conventional American military codes at various points earlier in the conflict, appear to have had essentially no meaningful success against Navajo Code Talker transmissions at any point in the Pacific War, based on the post-war historical record and on Japanese wartime signals intelligence documentation examined by historians after the conflict ended. Japanese cryptanalysts intercepting these transmissions faced a problem categorically different from breaking a conventional cipher, because a cipher, however sophisticated, is fundamentally a mathematical or symbolic transformation of an underlying language that a skilled cryptanalyst, with sufficient time and intercepted material, can eventually reverse engineer through pattern analysis. The Code Talker system, by contrast, first required understanding an entire unrelated spoken language, with almost no available published grammar, dictionary, or instructional material accessible outside a small community in the American Southwest, and only then required decoding the additional constructed vocabulary layered on top of that language, a vocabulary that existed nowhere in written form for an outside analyst to study or acquire. One documented case that illustrates the depth of this challenge involves a captured Navajo serviceman, not a code talker himself, but a Navajo soldier taken prisoner by Japanese forces earlier in the Pacific Campaign under different circumstances, who was reportedly questioned specifically about the meaning of intercepted Navajo language transmissions Japanese intelligence had recorded but could not interpret. Because this individual had no knowledge of the specific constructed code vocabulary used by trained code talkers. Despite being a fluent native Navajo speaker himself, he was unable to provide Japanese interrogators with any meaningful translation of the specific coded terminology they presented to him, since ordinary conversational Navajo bore no relationship to the specialized substitute vocabulary the code talkers had been trained to use. This episode, documented in post-war accounts, stands as a striking demonstration of exactly how effectively the dual-layer system, language plus constructed code, protected the program even under the most direct possible attempt to compromise it. A further layer of protection against potential compromise came from strict operational security surrounding the code talkers themselves, who were forbidden from discussing the specifics of their work even with other Marines outside their immediate signal units, and who in several documented instances were mistaken for Japanese soldiers by American troops unfamiliar with their presence or appearance, occasionally resulting in dangerous cases of friendly confusion that had to be resolved through the assignment of dedicated bodyguards to some code talkers, specifically to prevent them from being mistakenly fired upon by their own side, an unintended and uncomfortable consequence of a program whose secrecy was, by design, maintained even within the Marine Corps' own ranks. The Code Talker program's operational value peaked during the war's final and most demanding Pacific campaigns, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the sheer scale, speed, and complexity of coordinated Marine Corps operations placed enormous demands on secure, rapid battlefield communications. At Iwo Jima specifically, 6 Navajo Code Talkers reportedly worked in continuous rotation during the first 2 days of the battle alone, transmitting several hundred messages without a single error in transmission or translation across that period, according to figures later cited by Marine Corps signal officers involved in reviewing the program's wartime performance. This combination of speed, accuracy, and complete security, transmitted in real time under some of the heaviest combat conditions Marine forces faced in the entire war, represented the Code Talker program operating at the absolute peak of its intended purpose. 6 Code Talkers assigned to the 5th Marine Division at Iwo Jima worked in shifts around the clock during the battle's opening days specifically, a period widely regarded by military historians as among the most communications-intensive phases of any Pacific Island assault, given the compressed timeline and the sheer density of coordinated units operating across such a small landing area. The absence of any documented transmission errors across the hundreds of messages handled during this period stands in notable contrast to the more common error rates associated with conventional cipher-based communication systems under similarly intense combat conditions, where garbled transmissions, equipment failures, or encoding mistakes could and did introduce dangerous delays or misunderstandings in coordinating artillery and troop movements. Because the program's existence and specific methodology remained classified for years after the war ended, the Code Talkers themselves received little public recognition for their wartime service for decades, their contribution known in detail only to the small circle of Marine Corps officers who had worked with them directly during the war, a circumstance that meant many of the men who developed and used this system returned to civilian life after 1945, with no public acknowledgement of the specific role they had played in some of the Pacific War's most significant battles. The Battle of Okinawa, fought in the final months of the war, and involving an even larger scale of combined Marine and Army operations than Iwo Jima, placed similarly heavy demands on the Code Talker communications network, with Code Talkers embedded across multiple divisions, coordinating everything from routine logistics traffic to urgent requests for naval gunfire support during the sustained, grinding fighting that characterized the campaign's final weeks. The consistency of the program's performance across these 2 of the war's most demanding battles, coming at the very end of the Pacific Campaign after years of refinement in earlier engagements, reflected how thoroughly the system had matured from its improvised origins in 1942 into a fully integrated and trusted component of Marine Corps combat communications by the war's final year. The Navajo Code Talker program was formally declassified in 1968, more than 2 decades after the war's end, finally allowing public recognition of a contribution that had, for the majority of the intervening years, remained a closely guarded military secret even from most of the Code Talkers' own communities and families. Surviving Code Talkers and the families of those who had died were eventually honored through a series of formal recognitions in the following decades, culminating in congressional gold medals awarded to the program's original group of developers and congressional silver medals extended to the broader group of Navajo Marines who served as Code Talkers throughout the war, a recognition that arrived, for many of the men involved, only very late in their lives, or, for some, posthumously. The delay in public recognition also meant that many code talkers spent decades after the war unable to fully explain to their own families exactly what they had done during their military service, since the classification order that protected the program's methodology also prevented the men themselves from discussing it, even in general terms, with the people closest to them. Some code talkers' families only learned the specifics of this service after declassification in 1968, and in some cases only after a particular veteran's death, when documents and public ceremonies finally revealed the full scope of a contribution that had, for a generation, remained one of the more unusual open secrets of American military history, known in outline to exist but never explained in the detail its significance actually warranted. The program's legacy extends beyond its specific wartime achievements into a broader recognition of how the United States military, at a moment of genuine strategic need, drew directly on Native American linguistic and cultural knowledge to solve a problem that conventional American cryptographic resources had not fully solved on their own. A contribution that sits within a longer and more complicated history of the relationship between Native American communities and the United States government, one that the code talkers' own families and communities have continued to reflect on in the decades since the war's end, holding both genuine pride in the code talkers' wartime service and awareness of the broader historical context surrounding that service. The code itself, meanwhile, stands as one of the very few military codes of the entire Second World War that was never broken by any opposing power for the full duration of its operational use, a distinction achieved not through any mathematical or mechanical sophistication, but through the deliberate use of a living, spoken language that Japanese cryptanalysts, for all their skill against other American and Allied codes throughout the Pacific War, simply had no meaningful way to access. If you want to understand how a small group of Marines, speaking a language most of the world had never heard, built one of the only unbreakable codes of the entire Second World War, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.